Hola, aloha, ciao, users, programs, robots, robot fans. Okay. Today is a bit of a different episode, I suppose. I want to talk about female transformers in the IDW universe. So, just before we go more into it, spoilers ahead from different IDW comics, mostly Spotlight RC. Then we have Till All Are One Windblade, episode 1. And I think it's More Than Meet the Eye, number 17. There's more to it in the IDW universe, but there are a couple of issues that have always been unappreciated by the fandom, and I just wanted to sort of tackle the different inconsistencies and see what can be done with the current lore and where it's gone. So everything begins with this comic, Spotlight RC, and it's part of IDW's Phase 1. So it's written by Simon Furman, and the art is by Mal. So RC, mad, bad, and dangerous to know. That's RC, Autobot by allegiance, but just totally out of control. An untamable, unrestrained force of nature with tactics and ethics that would put many a Decepticon to shame, having waged a vitrolic war against a perceived enemy for many years. RC was finally brought to task and incarcerated. Driven by personal demons and severe mental trauma, RC is now considered just too dangerous to even be let loose. But sometimes, despite times call for desperate measures. Oh, before I go on, there's also spoilers to, I think, Robots in Disguise and Optimus Prime. I'm not sure when RC's past is revealed, but we'll get to that as well. So, spoilers for that too. What emerges from this comic and what is left into the lore is that, apart that differences between the classic RC and this RC is that this is not a sort of Princess Leia soft and sweet female addition to the cast for the benefit of the male cast and viewers, but it's a totally different sort of assassin gone angry female. And this partially seems to be explained by the fact that she's the only female. Now, this is in lore. Outside lore, at this point of Phase 1, there pretty much weren't many new robots. Now, IDW went into a phase of creating a whole set of new Transformers, more recently, which started with Drift, then got consolidated with Windblade, and then just sort of went kazoos after that, and we'll get to it. But don't you like all my ums? What comes out at the end of this episode, apart from RC's persona, is part of her past, and the crucial point is that she wasn't always a female, and she's been made into a female by Giaxus, which, if you don't know, is a mad scientist, pre-Decepticon baddie. So maybe I'll just, as I sort of jump through the images, there you go, this is Giaxus. And she ends sort of exacting her revenge on this character because she profoundly hates him, and this is sort of supposed to represent the deep trauma which was mentioned before. But as you see in this Phase 1, we still have a use of characters at most from unknown regions of the franchise, like toys that never were included in cartoon media, or robots from the Japanese cartoons, even beyond Headmaster. These in particular, I think, are taken from the Headmasters, some toys which didn't transform. Anyways, the point is that the implications, and I'm talking about RC because if you're looking at this image of Kickoff, which is also featured in Last Stand of the Wreckers, which I'm doing, and I'm working on the video right now. And this is why I'm working on this video a bit, because I want to include more of the lore around Last Stand of the Wreckers in my playlist. And just a sort of small parenthesis is, go check out my playlist. Everything on my channel is made to work around that playlist, and it's sort of a big story of the history of Transformers, or not the history of the product, but the history of the lore. Making one united lore that works together. So sort of editing out bits that don't work and just taking sort of the media that tells the story how I like it, and which keeps most elements in play. And of course the story of G9, which is then begins officially phase 2 in the IDW Transformer adventure, with Nick Roche and the start of James Roberts' implications with IDW. They sort of pick this. Garrus 9 is where they choose to put their story in Last Stand of the Wreckers, and this is G9 is a prison where RC is also kept imprisoned. So that is also some of the reasons that I want to include sort of this part, and since I've included part of Galvatron's story, as I like the element of the IDW universe that makes Galvatron a different character from Megatron completely, and I want to keep that element in my playlist. So and I also like the relationship with RC that has been revealed. So, and we'll get to that, but the implications of the fact that RC has been changed to a Transformer female on the lore of the IDW Transformers universe is that there are no other females, at least at the point of the story, which requires an in-story explanation. And that story explanation is that she was made into a female, but there aren't any Transformers, and we sort of are hinted to the fact that there might have been female Transformers in a more ancient past of the Transformer history, but that's where we're left, and this is where IDW left it for a very long time. While RC kept featuring in mostly I think in Robots in Disguise, which then became Optimus Prime, but as well she was a prominent part in the Sins of the Wreckers. So she's always been a prominent character. Now, before I jump onto Windblade, and I just wanted to show you sort of these images, which I was hoping would get to the G-axis part, which sort of stress her persona and the character they build around her. But she's just a straight-on badass, basically. Killer. Real angry chick, as you can see. And yeah, while we're at it, I totally don't want to get into the... No, well, apparently it's not in this episode. Forgive me if I can't find Jackson. So we have Tilorlar 1, which is a continuation of the episodes from the first Windblade comic, which was... let's see if we can find who it's... Margaret Scott, written by Margaret Scott. After the success of... well, Drift got a lot of hate from the fandom, until I think James Robert took him under his wing in More Than Meets the Eye. But before that, and Drift was sort of inspired from Japanese cars and drifting around Tokyo, so he's got swords and stuff, and look into him if you want. Anyways, After having created a new character for Transformers in recent times, they wanted to give it another try, and they sort of, Margaret Scott went into this, and she sort of at the time Transformers was two different comics which were written by Barber and James Robert, mostly More Than Meets the Eye and Robots in Disguise, which was the beginning of Phase 2. And they split, mostly Robots in Disguise, which was the story of what was going on Cybertron, between what eventually became Optimus Prime and Tillolar 1. So, and one was written by Margaret Scott and the other was written by Barber. Eventually in Margaret Scott's story, ancient colonies started popping up, and one of these ancient colonies was composed mostly from female Transformers. So, and this is how sort of Windblade is introduced into the lore, and so are a whole lot of other female cast, which aren't as predominant in the first phase, but eventually get a lot more of screen time, let's say. Initially, most of the characters were female characters from the episode of Elita 1, from the Sunbow episode, but they eventually just started making new ones, like the Dinobot. I think her name, it's not Slash. What is it? Yeah, Slash is a female Dinobot, etc. So with Windblade, eventually, so we have this inclusion of, and they start bringing a lot more of these colonists from the old planet colonies to Cybertron. And with them, obviously, we have more female characters coming, and one of these is, of course, Elita 1, which we see in this panel, but other colonies still had female characters. So it's leaving a whole lot of unexplained answers, but let's leave this at that, because there's talk in the fandom of romance, and the notion of romance has been addressed in More Than Meets the Eye, mostly by James Robert. Initially with Rewind and Chromodome, with this issue of the Spark Endura, which is sort of like we already had Transformers which were had a double spark, like Twin Twist and I don't know the other name, or what was it? There's more famous ones. Well, they don't come to mind. But an Endura I don't remember the name. Something Endura is basically a sort of bond, or a promise of a bond that robots take with each other if they feel a very strong kinship between each other. So and it borders on love and platonic love, I suppose, more. That's how that's the tone it's being given. But it's introduced the notion of romance and kinship between robots. So this is mostly the scenario we've been given, and then we've been given more explanations about RC, but it doesn't specifically address any of the issues on why Transformers would have genders, which to me is quite pivotal to the whole point. I mean, if you're going to introduce them, and if robots want to have female Transformers or different gender, then you have to address the reason this is happening, or why they want it. Now, before we dwell further into that, there's another point that we have to take in consideration when considering reproduction, as IDW has decided to address it. So, and this is hotspots. Now, hotspots are revealed, I think, they might have been revealed first, earlier, but at some point at the end of the first season of More Than Meets the Eye, yeah, there it is, that's a hotspot. We get this notion of hotspot, which is sort of some crop fields for Transformer hearts or sparks, which then need to be built. but this was the natural method of conception of transformers until a certain point, and apparently it died out sometime in the past. So there, which brings the IDW universe in a lore context where there can't be many new transformers. Now this sort of begins, or it's said to have begun, during Nova Prime's time, which is pre-Decepticons and Autobots, but is post the era of the 13 Primes and uniting of Cybertron under one kingdom, or whatever you want to call it. So these hotspots are supposed to disappear in that chronological period, so if you want to place the disappearance of females into chronological context, these are said to have gone away sometime when the Titans started going away to colonize outer space. Now, and if you want to go and see in my playlist, those are placed sometime after the era of Megatronus, and the Machinima suggests that Megatronus has defeated Unicron sometime in the past. So during the part of the history of the 13 Primes and the unification and whatever it is, Unicron apparently attacks Cybertron, and sometime after that the Titans sort of go out with after the death of Martelius, I think, so sometime before or sometimes after, there's this exodus. I'm confused about it because I don't think they sort of there's two different exoduses recently in Transformers Unicron. They've proposed an exodus post Prime, the 13 Primes, and I'm sorry, I'm confusing. Yeah, Megatronus is one of the same. Yeah, 13 Primes and the Circle of Light. So after the death of the Circle of Light, you have an exodus, and then sometimes during the era of the 13 Primes, you have an expansion, which in the Unicron era brings these Omega Sentinels into the tummy of Unicron, which are then eventually found. But so the first exodus is in between the era of the Guiding Hand and the 13 Primes, which is supposedly when we then don't have any more female Transformers, except we already see Solus Prime, which is supposed to be a female, be in love with Megatronus. Of course, this is Machinima, which is not part of the IDW universe. It's inspired by it, however, and very strongly, because the context in which Windblade and Starscream act, and Prime as well, and a good Megatron is sort of very much taken from IDW. It doesn't fit into the IDW lore, however, but if it goes to describing the ancient past, something that has been done as well by IDW, touching Megatronus and all these things, and introducing other primes like the 13th and so on, which is all the rage apparently now. This is sometime then females disappeared, and going back to Nova Prime, or what eventually becomes Nemesis Prime, G-Axis, by the time he's sort of all over combiners and trying to make Monstructor, after that he's also all over chicks, or robot chicks, which have disappeared, apparently, for some reason or another, exactly like the hotspots. Maybe not in the same period, but in that past. So what would be the reason for hotspots to be disappearing, and why would female hotspots, and why would female robots also disappear in this period? Well, I think there is a relationship, and you can't the elephant in the room is the fact that gender differentiation, and I don't want to get into any political discussions or why, is sort of from a biological or Darwinian point of view, addressing specifically one issue, which is reproduction. Now, unless we're talking about a species which is individual and singular, so transcends the notion of reproduction to perpetuate itself as a species. And so the individual is the defining element of the whole species, so eternity would be per se his goal. But biology has otherwise, unless it has created eternal beings. When it hasn't created eternal beings, it has opted for a different solution, which is continuity, reproduction. And we have examples in nature, or in the Darwinian rules of the universe, of frogs and other animals that when there aren't any means of reproduction, like males or whatever, they have in their genetic, within their genetic ability, or whatever you want to say, to sort of change sex towards the required lack, I suppose. Hence, what I'm trying to say is you can't really disconnect the notion of gender diversification. I mean, if there's only one gender, sure, but if there's two, there needs to be not only a reason for each gender, but also a reason, a specific Darwinian reason for the diversification, for having two genders, or three or four, or whatever it is. But if you have more than one, then you need to have a reason for having those genders. I mean, biology and evolution spends energy in moving into directions. So if it moves into the direction, it has to have a motive for it. And I can't see any other motive to gender diversity if not for reproduction. So having established that we have in Transformers history romance, and having established that we have natural conception hotspots, and that these are somehow related to females robots because they disappeared in the same period, and that is when Transformers in the IDW universe lost the ability to naturally procreate. The reintroduction of Transformers females into the IDW universe in a later period in their history it cannot but be for the means of reproduction, which have been addressed in other ways, but they've sort of wanted to bring female robots into the picture, is I guess what I'm trying to say, forcibly on the narrative, and it's always been sort of awkwardish how they did it, and they've never, but they seem to be doing it more for sort of political, social warrior reasons, or whatever you want to call them, than for the story itself. So it doesn't make much sense in the story. I mean, whether you like it or not, where you like the solution I've just proposed. So reproduction, having female Transformers means there should be a reproduction between the robots. This means that they haven't addressed the current. Sorry, I don't know if that was. We'll continue. It was an audio interruption. So this is why people are confused about the argument. It's not because you should or should not have female Transformers. That's not what anybody is saying. I think what people are trying to get to is that it doesn't make sense into the lore, that we would like to have a proper lore context to it, something that makes sense for the lore of the Transformers and not for political Earth reasons, or whatever you want to call them. And that's what makes a bad narrative, because if it's done for other reasons and pushed in directions which the narrative doesn't necessarily go to, it's just going to be wacky writing and bad reading, or confusing reading at best. And this is why it's left sort of a lot of fans with sour in their mouth. It's got nothing to do with not wanting a female cast or female robots. It's just that if you do want them, then just it's pointless to put a female robot and make her look like she's dressed in a bikini when she's in, you know, get my point, because that's not for females, that's not for a female audience. And not give it a reason in the story. I think that's much more unrespectful to the whole argument than addressing the argument from the story's point of view. And that's all I have to say on the argument. So that's IDW Female Robots explained from my perspective.